Hello and welcome. Today, we're going to delve into the life of one of the most iconic and complex figures of the 20th century, Winston Churchill. Known for his indomitable spirit, stirring oratory, and steadfast leadership during World War II, Churchill's legacy is as vast as it is intricate. He was a man of contradictions, a staunch defender of democracy, yet a product of the British Empire's colonial past, a war hero who cherished peace, and a statesman whose decisions shaped not only the fate of Britain but also the course of world history. Churchill's life was marked by both triumphs and controversies, from his early years as a soldier and journalist to his tenure as Prime Minister during Britain's darkest and finest hours. His speeches inspired a nation under siege, and his unwavering resolve became a symbol of hope for millions around the world. But who was the man behind the myth? What drove Winston Churchill to become the leader we remember today? As we journey through his life, we'll explore the events that shaped him, the challenges he faced, and the lasting impact of his actions. So, sit back, relax, and let's dive into the extraordinary story of Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was born on November 30th, 1874, at Blenheim Palace, a grand estate in Oxfordshire, England. He was born into one of Britain's most prominent aristocratic families, the Marlboroughs, with a lineage that traced back to the Duke of Marlborough, one of Britain's greatest military leaders. This heritage would profoundly influence Churchill's life and his sense of destiny. At the time of Churchill's birth, the world was undergoing rapid change. The late 19th century was marked by the height of the British Empire, which was the largest empire the world had ever seen. Britain was the dominant global power, controlling vast territories across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The sun, as the saying went, never set on the British Empire. This era was one of confidence and expansion for Britain, driven by industrial might, naval supremacy, and a belief in the civilizing mission of empire. Europe, however, was a continent of contrasts. While Britain and other Western European nations were enjoying the benefits of industrialization, technological advancements, and relative political stability, tensions were simmering beneath the surface. The unification of Germany in 1871 had altered the balance of power in Europe, leading to a complex web of alliances and rivalries that would later culminate in World War I. Meanwhile, the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires were struggling to maintain their influence as nationalism and calls for independence grew among their diverse populations. In the United States, the post-Civil War era was marked by Reconstruction and rapid industrial growth. The country was emerging as a new industrial powerhouse, but it was also grappling with the social and political challenges of Reconstruction, the integration of freed slaves into society, and the beginning of the labor movement. In Asia, Japan was undergoing the Meiji Restoration, a period of rapid modernization and westernization that would transform it into a major world power. China, however, was facing internal strife and external pressure, particularly from European powers eager to carve out spheres of influence within the country. The world that Churchill was born into was one of great empires, technological progress, and emerging nationalism. It was a world in which the seeds of future conflicts were being sown, even as many people believed in the stability and permanence of the existing order. This era of imperial grandeur and complex geopolitics would shape Churchill's worldview and the decisions he would make as a leader in the decades to come. As a child of privilege, Churchill's early life was one of luxury and opportunity, but it was also marked by a sense of duty and expectation. He was born into a family that believed in service to the nation, and from a young age, he was imbued with a deep sense of responsibility to uphold the traditions and values of his ancestors. Little did the world know that this child, born into an era of imperial confidence, would grow up to become one of the most important figures of the 20th century, leading Britain through its darkest hours and helping to shape the modern world. Winston Churchill's family background was both illustrious and complex, deeply influencing his character, ambitions, and the course of his life. He was born into two of Britain's most prominent and influential families, each with its own distinct legacy. Father, Lord Randolph Churchill. Winston's father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a significant political figure in his own right. A member of the Conservative Party, he served as Chancellor of the Exchequer and leader of the House of Commons. Lord Randolph was known for his brilliant oratory, sharp wit, and a political career that, despite its early promise, was ultimately marked by controversy and decline. Randolph Churchill was the second son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough, a title with deep historical significance in Britain. The Dukes of Marlborough were descendants of John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, who was a celebrated military commander and a key figure in British history. This lineage placed Winston Churchill in the heart of Britain's aristocratic and political elite from birth. However, Lord Randolph's career was cut short due to ill health, and his relationship with the Conservative Party became increasingly strained. He resigned from his post as Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1886 over a disagreement with his party, a decision that many viewed as a grave miscalculation. This resignation marked the beginning of his political decline, and he died relatively young, at the age of 45, when Winston was just 20 years old. Despite his father's early death, Winston always idolized Randolph, seeing him as a brilliant, if flawed, figure whose legacy he sought to uphold and surpass. Mother, Jennie Jerome. Winston's mother, Jennie Jerome, was an American, born in Brooklyn, New York, in 1854. She was the daughter of Leonard Jerome, a wealthy and influential financier, and Clarissa Hall. Jennie was one of the so-called dollar princesses of the era, wealthy American heiresses who married into the British aristocracy, bringing their fortunes and, often, a more modern and cosmopolitan outlook with them. Jennie was known for her beauty, charm, and social grace, which made her a prominent figure in both British and American society. She was a close friend of the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, and moved in the highest social circles of the day. Her marriage to Lord Randolph was one of both love and practicality, strengthening ties between the British aristocracy and wealthy American families. Jennie was a significant influence on Winston, particularly in his early years. She was not a conventional mother by the standards of the time. She was more often occupied with social events and political intrigues than with her children. However, Winston adored her, and she played a crucial role in his life, particularly after his father's death. Jennie's wit, intelligence, and social connections helped Winston in his early political career, and she remained a significant figure in his life until her death in 1921. The Churchill siblings. Winston Churchill had one younger brother, John Strange Spencer Churchill, known as Jack. Born in 1880, Jack was less prominent than his older brother, but was a supportive and loyal sibling. Jack served in the British Army during World War I and later pursued a successful career in business. The brothers were close throughout their lives, and Jack's quiet competence and steady demeanor provided a contrast to Winston's more flamboyant and ambitious personality. Family legacy and influence. The Churchill family's aristocratic lineage and political connections provided Winston with opportunities that few others could access. However, this legacy also came with significant expectations. From a young age, Winston was aware of his family's history and the pressure to uphold its name. The Marlboroughs were a family with a storied past, and Winston's father, despite his political setbacks, was a man of great talent and ambition. These factors instilled in Winston a strong sense of duty and a desire to achieve greatness. Winston's upbringing was one of privilege but also of distance. His parents, particularly his mother, were often absent, and he was largely raised by nannies and sent to boarding schools from a young age. This sense of distance and the need to prove himself in the shadow of his father's legacy would shape Winston Churchill's character, driving him to seek success and recognition on his own terms. In summary, Winston Churchill's family background was a blend of British aristocracy and American wealth, of political ambition and social grace. The influences of his father and mother, both in their successes and their shortcomings, left a profound mark on Winston, setting the stage for the extraordinary life he would go on to lead. Winston Churchill's early years, from birth to the age of 10, were formative in many ways, though they were marked by a mix of privilege, loneliness, and early glimpses of the character traits that would define him as an adult. Birth and early childhood at Blenheim Palace. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born on November 30th, 1874, at Blenheim Palace, the grand ancestral home of the Dukes of Marlborough. The palace, a symbol of his aristocratic heritage, was where Winston spent the first few months of his life, surrounded by the opulence and history that his family represented. Despite the grandeur of his surroundings, Winston's early childhood was somewhat solitary. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was deeply involved in his political career, and his mother, Jenny Jerome, was a prominent socialite who spent much of her time in London. As a result, Winston was largely raised by his nanny, Elizabeth Everest, whom he affectionately called Mom. Mrs. Everest was a constant presence in his early years, providing him with the affection and care that his parents often could not. Winston would later recall her with great fondness, seeing her as a source of comfort and stability during his childhood. Early education and struggles at St. George's School. At the age of 7, Winston was sent to St. George's School in Ascot, a boarding school chosen by his parents. This marked the beginning of a difficult period in his life. Winston struggled at St. George's, both academically and socially. He was not a particularly diligent student, and his rebellious nature made it difficult for him to conform to the strict discipline of the school. He often found himself in trouble, earning the reputation of being a troublemaker. Winston's academic performance was poor, particularly in subjects that required rote learning and memorization, such as Latin and mathematics. He later described his time at St. George's as miserable, marked by frequent punishments and a sense of isolation. The school's harsh environment did little to foster his intellectual curiosity, and Winston often felt neglected and misunderstood. The physical environment was also a challenge for Winston. He was prone to illness, suffering from various ailments during his time at St. George's. These illnesses, coupled with the cold and austere atmosphere of the school, added to his unhappiness. Transfer to Miss Thompson's preparatory school. Recognizing that St. George's was not a good fit for their son, Winston's parents eventually decided to move him to a new school. At the age of 9, he was transferred to Miss Thompson's preparatory school in Brighton. This school, though still a boarding institution, offered a more nurturing environment, and Winston began to thrive academically, particularly in subjects that allowed him to use his imagination and creativity, such as history and English. Winston excelled at Sandhurst, graduating 8th in his class of 150 cadets in December 1894. His performance was a source of great pride, especially considering his earlier academic struggles. The rigorous training and discipline at Sandhurst also helped to shape his character, instilling in him a sense of responsibility, leadership, and resilience. The death of Lord Randolph Churchill. A significant event during this period was the death of Winston's father, Lord Randolph Churchill, in January 1895, when Winston was just 20 years old. Lord Randolph's health had been deteriorating for several years, and his death from what was likely a combination of syphilis and other illnesses was a profound loss for Winston. Despite their strained relationship, Winston had always looked up to his father and longed for his approval. Lord Randolph's death marked the end of Winston's quest for his father's recognition and left him with a deep sense of loss. However, it also motivated him to make his own mark on the world and to carry on the Churchill legacy in his own way. Early military experiences. Shortly after graduating from Sandhurst, Winston was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, a cavalry regiment in the British Army. His military career began in earnest, and he was eager to prove himself. Winston's early military service was characterized by a combination of adventure and ambition. He was posted to various locations, including India and Sudan, where he gained valuable experience and began to build a reputation as a brave and resourceful officer. Winston also began to establish himself as a writer during this time. He wrote dispatches and reports from the field, which were published in British newspapers. These writings not only helped to supplement his income, but also began to build his public profile. His experiences in the military, combined with his growing reputation as a writer, laid the foundation for his later career as both a soldier and a politician. Conclusion of the second decade. By the time Winston Churchill reached the age of 20, he had undergone significant personal and professional development. He had overcome early academic struggles, established a clear direction for his future, and begun to carve out a name for himself in both the military and literary worlds. The death of his father had left a lasting impact on him, driving him to pursue success with even greater determination. Winston's early military experiences, combined with his aristocratic heritage and his growing ambition, set the stage for the extraordinary career that would follow. These years were crucial in shaping the man who would go on to lead Britain through its darkest hours, and they provided him with the skills, knowledge, and confidence to take on the challenges that lay ahead. Winston Churchill's life between the ages of 20 and 30 was a time of intense activity, personal growth, and the laying of foundations for his future career. As a young man, Churchill was determined to make a name for himself, and he pursued this goal with energy and ambition, embracing both military service and writing as his paths to distinction. At 20, Churchill was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, a cavalry regiment of the British Army. He quickly realized that while the military offered adventure, it also entailed a lot of routine and boredom, especially in peacetime. Stationed in India, he began to immerse himself in reading and self-education. His time in India was formative. He read extensively, not just military strategy and history, but also political theory and philosophy. This period of study was crucial in shaping his intellectual development, providing him with the knowledge and perspectives that would later inform his political career. Churchill was not content with simply serving in the army. He sought action and adventure. In 1897, he joined the Malacan Field Force on the northwest frontier of India, participating in combat against local tribesmen. The experience was both thrilling and harrowing, and it provided him with material for his first book, The Story of the Malacan Field Force. This work, along with the articles he wrote as a war correspondent, began to establish his reputation back in Britain as both a soldier and a writer. His appetite for adventure led him next to Egypt in 1898, where he served under General Kitchener in the campaign to reconquer the Sudan. Churchill participated in the Battle of Omdurman, a decisive clash that showcased the power of modern weaponry against less equipped forces. Once again, he wrote about his experiences, publishing The River War, a detailed account of the campaign. His writing was not just a way to earn extra income, it was also a means of shaping public opinion and building his personal brand. By 1899, Churchill's restless ambition and desire for recognition led him to resign his commission in the army and focus on journalism and politics. He traveled to South Africa as a war correspondent to cover the Second Boer War, a conflict between the British Empire and the Boer settlers in what is now South Africa. This decision would prove pivotal in his life. During his time there, Churchill was captured by the Boers during an ambush, an event that could have ended his career. However, in a daring and well-publicized escape, he managed to flee from his captors and make his way back to British lines. This escape turned him into a national hero and significantly boosted his public profile. Returning to Britain in 1900 as a celebrated war hero and a successful writer, Churchill leveraged his newfound fame to enter politics. He ran for Parliament as a Conservative candidate in the Oldham constituency and won his first seat at the age of 25. This marked the beginning of his long and illustrious political career. However, even as a young MP, Churchill was not one to simply follow the party line. His independent streak, which would later define much of his career, began to show itself early on as he spoke out on issues where he believed the party was wrong. In the early years of his political career, Churchill continued to write and publish extensively, cementing his reputation as a brilliant and insightful commentator on military and political matters. His books and articles brought him both income and influence, allowing him to maintain his lifestyle and to build connections in both political and social circles. As he approached the age of 30, Churchill's career was on an upward trajectory, but it was also marked by restlessness and a desire to find his true place in the political landscape. His experiences in the army, as a war correspondent, and as a young MP had given him a broad perspective on the world and on Britain's role in it. However, he was not yet the towering figure of British politics that he would later become. These years were crucial in shaping his ambitions, his beliefs, and his approach to leadership, setting the stage for the pivotal roles he would play in the years to come. As Winston Churchill entered his 30s, his career began to gain momentum, and he became increasingly influential in British politics. His reputation as a bold and independent thinker continued to grow, and he quickly established himself as a rising star in the Conservative Party. However, Churchill was never one to simply follow the path laid out for him, and this decade of his life was marked by both significant achievements and controversial decisions. In the early 1900s, Churchill served as a member of Parliament for Oldham, but he soon found himself at odds with his party on several key issues. His strong belief in social reform and his concerns about the Conservative Party's resistance to change led him to make a dramatic decision. In 1904, Churchill crossed the floor of the House of Commons and joined the Liberal Party. This move was seen as a betrayal by many of his Conservative colleagues, but for Churchill, it was a necessary step to align himself with a party that better matched his evolving views on social justice, free trade, and the role of government. Churchill's switch to the Liberal Party opened new opportunities for him. He quickly rose through the ranks, and in 1906 he was appointed Under Secretary of State for the Colonies, a position that allowed him to influence British policy in its vast empire. During his tenure, Churchill advocated for greater self-governance in the colonies and pushed for reforms that he believed would help modernize and stabilize British rule. His time in this role gave him a deeper understanding of the complexities of the British Empire and the challenges of governing a diverse and far-flung empire. In 1908, Churchill's career took another significant step forward when he was appointed President of the Board of Trade, one of the most important positions in the British government. In this role, he focused on social and economic reforms designed to improve the lives of the working class. Churchill was instrumental in the creation of the Trade Boards Act of 1909, which established minimum wage boards in industries where wages were notoriously low. This legislation was a major victory for the labor movement and showcased Churchill's commitment to improving the conditions of the working poor. During this period, Churchill also became closely associated with the Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, who was leading efforts to introduce sweeping social reforms. Together, they championed the People's Budget of 1909, which sought to raise taxes on the wealthy to fund social welfare programs, including old age pensions and unemployment benefits. This budget sparked a constitutional crisis, as the conservative-dominated House of Lords initially rejected it, leading to a fierce political battle that ultimately resulted in the reduction of the Lords' power and the passage of the budget. Churchill's role in this conflict cemented his reputation as a fearless advocate for reform and a leader willing to challenge the establishment. As his political career flourished, Churchill's personal life also saw significant developments. In 1908, at the age of 33, he married Clementine Hosier, a woman of intelligence, grace, and strong character. Their marriage was a true partnership, with Clementine providing Churchill with invaluable support throughout his career. Together, they would have 5 children, and their relationship would remain a cornerstone of Churchill's life. In 1910, Churchill was appointed Home Secretary, a role that put him in charge of law and order in Britain. This position brought him into the spotlight in a new way, as he dealt with a series of high-profile incidents, including the siege of Sydney Street in 1911, where Churchill personally oversaw a police operation against armed anarchists in London. His involvement in this incident was controversial, with some accusing him of overstepping his authority, but it also demonstrated his hands-on approach to leadership. Churchill's tenure as Home Secretary was also marked by his continued push for social reforms. He introduced measures to improve prison conditions and advocated for the use of probation and rehabilitation rather than harsh punishments for minor offenders. His progressive views on criminal justice were ahead of their time and reflected his broader belief in the need for government to play a positive role in improving society. By the time Churchill reached his 40th birthday, he had already made a significant impact on British politics. He had demonstrated his willingness to break with tradition and challenge the status quo, whether by switching parties, advocating for social reform, or taking bold action in times of crisis. However, his journey was far from over. The next decade of his life would bring even greater challenges and opportunities, as he took on new roles and faced some of the most defining moments of his career. As Winston Churchill moved into his 40s, his career continued to advance, and he took on even greater responsibilities within the British government. The years that followed would prove to be some of the most pivotal in his life, as he navigated both triumphs and setbacks, all while positioning himself as a key figure on the national and international stage. In 1911, Churchill was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, the top civilian position in the Royal Navy. This role placed him at the heart of Britain's military establishment, responsible for overseeing the Navy at a time when Europe was becoming increasingly unstable. Churchill threw himself into the job with his characteristic energy and enthusiasm. He recognized the growing threat posed by Germany's naval expansion and was determined to ensure that Britain maintained its maritime supremacy. Under Churchill's leadership, the Royal Navy underwent significant modernization. He championed the development of new technologies, including the construction of the first modern battleships, known as dreadnoughts. He also pushed for the adoption of oil-powered ships, which were faster and more efficient than the older coal-powered vessels. Churchill's efforts to strengthen the Navy were part of a broader strategy to prepare Britain for the possibility of a major conflict in Europe. However, Churchill's time at the Admiralty was not without controversy. His ambitious plans for naval expansion were expensive, and they drew criticism from those who believed that Britain should be focusing on domestic issues rather than preparing for war. Nevertheless, Churchill was convinced that a strong navy was essential to Britain's security, and he continued to advocate for military preparedness. In 1914, Churchill's fears of a European war were realized when World War I broke out. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he played a crucial role in the early stages of the conflict. He was instrumental in securing the Royal Navy's dominance over the seas, which allowed Britain to impose a naval blockade on Germany, cutting off vital supplies and weakening the enemy's war effort. Churchill's strategic thinking and decisive action earned him praise, but the war also brought immense challenges. One of the most significant episodes during this period was the Gallipoli campaign in 1915, a bold but ultimately disastrous attempt to break the deadlock on the Western Front by attacking the Ottoman Empire. The campaign was Churchill's brainchild, and he believed that a successful assault on the Dardanelles Strait would open a new front and knock the Ottomans out of the war. However, the operation was poorly executed, and the Allied forces suffered heavy casualties. The failure of Gallipoli was a major blow to Churchill's reputation, and he was forced to resign from the Admiralty. The Gallipoli debacle was a humbling experience for Churchill. He was deeply affected by the loss of life and the personal criticism he faced. Despite the setback, Churchill did not retreat from public life. Instead, he sought to redeem himself by returning to military service. In 1916, he took up a command in the British Army on the Western Front, serving as a battalion commander in the trenches of France. This experience gave him a first-hand understanding of the horrors of war and reinforced his determination to find ways to end the conflict. By the end of this 5-year period, Churchill had experienced both the heights of political power and the depths of public disfavor. His time as First Lord of the Admiralty had shown his capacity for bold leadership and innovation, but the failure at Gallipoli had tarnished his reputation. Despite these challenges, Churchill's resilience and refusal to be defeated by adversity would prove to be defining characteristics of his life. The lessons he learned during these years would shape his approach to leadership in the years to come as he continued to navigate the turbulent waters of British politics and global affairs. Following his service on the Western Front, Winston Churchill returned to England in early 1916, determined to rehabilitate his political career and continue contributing to the nation's efforts during the Great War. The experiences he had endured in the trenches profoundly affected him, providing a sobering perspective on the realities of warfare and deepening his understanding of the sacrifices made by ordinary soldiers. This first-hand experience bolstered his credibility and informed his subsequent political decisions, particularly regarding military and defense matters. Despite the lingering shadow of the Gallipoli campaign, Churchill's resilience and unwavering commitment to public service facilitated his gradual reintegration into government roles. Initially, he faced resistance and skepticism from both political colleagues and the public. However, his talent, energy, and persuasive abilities could not be overlooked for long. In July 1917, Prime Minister David Lloyd George recognized Churchill's capabilities and appointed him as Minister of Munitions, a critical position responsible for overseeing the production and supply of arms and ammunition to the British forces. As Minister of Munitions, Churchill threw himself into the role with characteristic vigor and innovation. He inherited a complex and strained system struggling to meet the enormous demands of a protracted war. Understanding the urgency, Churchill implemented comprehensive reforms aimed at increasing efficiency and output. He advocated for the adoption of new technologies and manufacturing techniques, fostering collaboration between government departments, private industries, and scientific communities. Under his leadership, munitions production saw significant improvements, ensuring that British and Allied troops were better equipped as the war entered its final stages. One of Churchill's notable contributions during this time was his support for the development and deployment of tanks, a relatively new and untested weapon. Recognizing their potential to break the stalemate of trench warfare, he championed increased production and strategic use of armored vehicles on the battlefield. This advocacy played a part in the successful Allied offensives of 1918, which ultimately contributed to the breaking of German lines and the hastening of the war's end. Beyond production logistics, Churchill also demonstrated concern for the welfare of munitions workers, many of whom were women contributing to the war effort in unprecedented numbers. He pushed for better working conditions, fair wages, and adequate housing, understanding that the morale and well-being of the workforce were essential to maintaining high levels of productivity. These efforts not only improved immediate outcomes but also set precedents for labor relations in the post-war period. The armistice in November 1918 marked the end of World War I, but for Churchill, it signaled the beginning of a new set of challenges. In January 1919, he was appointed Secretary of State for War and Air, placing him at the forefront of managing Britain's transition from wartime to peacetime. This role encompassed a vast array of responsibilities, including the demobilization of millions of soldiers, the restructuring of military forces, and addressing numerous conflicts and uprisings across the remnants of the British Empire and Europe. Demobilization presented a massive logistical and social challenge. Soldiers were eager to return home, but the process needed to be orderly to prevent chaos and ensure stability. Churchill devised and oversaw a demobilization plan that prioritized individuals based on length of service and family needs, striving to balance fairness with practicality. While not without difficulties, the demobilization process under his guidance was largely successful, allowing millions to reintegrate into civilian life and mitigating potential unrest. Simultaneously, Churchill grappled with the complex and contentious issue of British involvement in the Russian Civil War. Following the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia had descended into chaos, and Churchill emerged as one of the most vocal advocates for intervention against the Bolsheviks, whom he viewed as a profound threat to European stability and Western civilization. He authorized and organized support for the White Army, including the provision of arms, supplies, and limited troop deployments. This policy was controversial and faced opposition both within the government and among the public, weary of war and skeptical of further military engagements. Despite his efforts, the intervention failed to alter the outcome of the Russian Civil War, and by 1920, British forces were withdrawn. The episode remains a debated aspect of Churchill's career, reflecting his staunch anti-communism and willingness to take bold, albeit risky, action on the international stage. Domestically, Churchill also had to address unrest in Ireland, where the struggle for independence had intensified following the war. The conflict between Irish nationalists and British authorities escalated into the Irish War of Independence, marked by guerrilla warfare and political strife. Churchill supported measures aimed at restoring order, but also recognized the need for a political solution. He participated in discussions and negotiations that eventually led to the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, which established the Irish Free State. These events unfolded just after this 5-year period, but were influenced by the policies and groundwork laid during his tenure. In addition to his governmental duties, Churchill continued to engage in writing and public speaking, further establishing himself as a prominent and eloquent voice in British politics. He published several works during this time, including accounts of his war experiences and reflections on contemporary political issues. These writings not only enhanced his public profile, but also provided valuable insights into his thoughts and motivations during a tumultuous period. On the personal front, Churchill's family life provided stability and support amid the pressures of public service. His marriage to Clementine remained strong, and they expanded their family with the births of their children, Sarah in 1914 and Marigold in 1918. Tragically, Marigold died in 1921 at the age of 2, a devastating loss for the family that deeply affected Churchill and his wife. Despite such hardships, the Churchill household was characterized by close bonds and mutual support, with Clementine playing a crucial role in advising and grounding her husband throughout his career. As the early 1920s approached, Churchill found himself at a crossroads. His tenure as Secretary of State for War and Air had been marked by significant challenges and mixed results, but his reputation for determination, strategic thinking, and eloquence remained intact. The experiences of these years, both triumphant and difficult, enriched his understanding of international affairs, military strategy, and the complexities of governance. These lessons would prove invaluable as he continued to navigate the ever-changing landscape of British and global politics in the decades to come. The 5 years following Winston Churchill's tenure as Secretary of State for War and Air were a period of both significant achievement and notable political challenges. These years saw Churchill navigating the shifting political landscape of post-war Britain, facing both personal and professional upheavals, and further establishing himself as a central figure in British politics. In 1921, Churchill was appointed Secretary of State for the Colonies, a role that placed him at the heart of Britain's efforts to manage its vast empire during a period of increasing unrest and demands for self-determination. This position brought with it a host of complex issues, particularly in the Middle East and Ireland, where tensions were high and the desire for independence was growing. One of the most significant challenges Churchill faced during this time was the ongoing conflict in Ireland. The Irish War of Independence, which had escalated in the years following World War I, was reaching a critical point. Churchill played a key role in the negotiations that led to the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. This treaty established the Irish Free State, a self-governing dominion within the British Empire, while allowing Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom. The treaty was a contentious compromise, and while it brought an end to the war, it also led to a bitter civil war in Ireland between those who supported the treaty and those who opposed it. Churchill's involvement in the Irish negotiations showcased his ability to navigate complex political situations and his willingness to seek pragmatic solutions even when they were unpopular. However, the aftermath of the treaty also highlighted the deep divisions within the United Kingdom and the challenges of managing an empire in a changing world. In the Middle East, Churchill faced another set of challenges. As Secretary of State for the colonies, he was responsible for overseeing British mandates in territories such as Palestine, Iraq, and Transjordan, which had been carved out of the defeated Ottoman Empire after World War I. The Middle East was a region of strategic importance to Britain, particularly due to its oil resources, but it was also a region of deep-seated ethnic and religious tensions. Churchill's approach to governing these mandates involved a combination of military presence and political negotiation. He supported the establishment of the Hashemite kingdoms in Iraq and Transjordan, viewing them as a way to stabilize the region and maintain British influence. However, his policies in the Middle East were not without controversy. The British administration faced resistance and rebellion in several territories, particularly in Iraq, where Churchill authorized the use of air power to suppress uprisings. These actions were effective in the short term but contributed to long-term instability in the region. Churchill's time as colonial secretary left a complex legacy, reflecting both his ability to manage Britain's imperial interests and the inherent difficulties of maintaining control over diverse and distant territories. Domestically, Churchill's political career continued to evolve during these years. In 1922, he found himself at odds with his own party over a range of issues, including the government's handling of the economy and foreign policy. The post-war economic situation in Britain was difficult, with rising unemployment and social unrest. Churchill's support for fiscal austerity and his opposition to the growing influence of the Labour Party placed him in a precarious position within the political establishment. This tension came to a head in 1922 when the Conservative Party, with which Churchill was still associated despite his earlier defection to the Liberals, withdrew its support for the coalition government led by Prime Minister David Lloyd George. The resulting general election saw a shift in power, with the Conservatives gaining a majority and Churchill losing his seat in Parliament. This defeat was a significant setback for Churchill, marking the first time in his career that he found himself out of office and without a clear political role. Undeterred by this loss, Churchill remained active in public life, continuing to write and speak on political issues. His time out of office allowed him to reflect on his experiences and refine his ideas, particularly regarding Britain's economic and foreign policy. In 1924, Churchill made a dramatic political comeback, re-entering Parliament as a Conservative MP for Epping. His return to the Conservative Party was a calculated move, reflecting his recognition that the Liberals were in decline and that his future lay within the ranks of the Tories. Churchill's decision to rejoin the Conservatives was not without controversy, and he faced criticism from both former Liberal colleagues and Conservative stalwarts who were suspicious of his loyalty. However, his undeniable talents and determination quickly re-established him as a force to be reckoned with in British politics. His return to Parliament coincided with a period of significant economic challenges, including the need to stabilize Britain's currency and address the country's growing debt. In 1924, shortly after his re-election, Churchill was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. This was one of the highest and most prestigious offices in the British government, and it marked a new chapter in Churchill's career. As Chancellor, Churchill was responsible for overseeing the nation's finances at a time of economic uncertainty. His most controversial decision during his tenure was the return of Britain to the gold standard in 1925, a policy that sought to restore the pre-war parity of the British pound with gold. Churchill's decision to return to the gold standard was driven by a desire to stabilize the currency and restore Britain's financial credibility on the world stage. However, the policy had significant negative consequences for the British economy. The overvalued pound made British exports more expensive and less competitive, leading to deflation, increased unemployment, and industrial strife. The decision was widely criticized, and in hindsight, it is considered one of Churchill's major economic missteps. Despite the challenges and setbacks of these years, Churchill's time as Chancellor of the Exchequer further cemented his reputation as a bold and ambitious statesman. He continued to demonstrate his resilience in the face of adversity and his willingness to take risks in pursuit of his vision for Britain. As he approached the end of this 5-year period, Churchill was once again at the center of British political life, navigating the complexities of leadership and preparing for the next chapter in his storied career. In 1929, the Conservative government, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, was defeated in a general election, and Churchill found himself out of office. The election brought the Labour Party to power under Ramsay MacDonald, and with it, a shift in the political landscape that left Churchill increasingly marginalized. His return to the Conservative Party had already been met with skepticism by many of his colleagues, and his controversial decisions as Chancellor of the Exchequer, particularly the return to the gold standard, had damaged his standing within the party. Without a ministerial position, Churchill entered what would later be known as his wilderness years. During this time, he was free from the responsibilities of government but also lacked the influence that came with holding office. Rather than retreating from public life, Churchill used this period to continue writing, speaking, and reflecting on the state of the world. He published several volumes of his memoirs, including The World Crisis, a multi-volume history of World War I that combined personal recollections with broader historical analysis. These works helped to maintain his public profile and reinforced his reputation as a historian and commentator on global affairs. However, it was not just his writings that kept Churchill in the public eye. He became increasingly concerned about the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany. As early as 1932, Churchill began to speak out against the dangers posed by Nazi ideology and the militarization of Germany. While many in Britain, including members of the government, were inclined to pursue a policy of appeasement or were simply unwilling to confront the growing threat, Churchill was one of the few prominent voices warning of the potential catastrophe that lay ahead. Churchill's warnings were not always well received. In fact, his outspoken views often alienated him from both his party and the broader political establishment. Many saw him as a relic of the past, out of touch with the realities of the post-World War I world. His calls for rearmament and preparation for potential conflict were dismissed by those who believed that Britain's priority should be economic recovery and maintaining peace through diplomacy. Churchill's insistence on the need to stand firm against tyranny was seen by some as alarmist and out of step with the prevailing mood of the country. Despite this isolation, Churchill remained resolute. He continued to gather information on the situation in Germany, relying on a network of contacts and intelligence sources. He also sought to build alliances with like-minded individuals who shared his concerns, including figures within the military and the political establishment. Churchill's speeches during this period, delivered both in Parliament and at public events, were marked by a growing sense of urgency. He warned that the world was facing a new and dangerous form of totalitarianism that threatened not only Europe but civilization itself. At the same time, Churchill's personal life provided some respite from the political battles he was fighting. His marriage to Clementine remained strong, and his family life brought him joy and stability. He continued to write prolifically, not just about politics, but also on a wide range of topics, including history, philosophy, and even painting, a hobby he had taken up during World War I and which provided him with a creative outlet. The early 1930s were also a time when Churchill began to see the broader picture of global threats. He spoke out against not just the rise of Nazi Germany but also the dangers posed by the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. Churchill was deeply distrustful of communism, viewing it as another form of tyranny that threatened the values of democracy and individual liberty. His criticisms of both the far right and far left placed him in a unique position, one that was increasingly at odds with the mainstream political consensus in Britain. As 1934 approached, the political and international landscape was becoming more precarious. The Nazi regime in Germany was consolidating its power, and Churchill's warnings were beginning to resonate with a growing, albeit still small, section of the British public. However, he remained a figure on the margins of political life, without the official platform to influence policy directly. Yet, these years of political isolation were crucial in shaping Churchill's views and strategies for the future. They allowed him the space to develop his thoughts on the nature of totalitarianism, the importance of military preparedness, and the need for strong leadership in the face of global threats. While many dismissed him as a spent force, Churchill was, in fact, preparing for what would become the most significant and defining role of his life. By 1934, Churchill had positioned himself as a vocal critic of the appeasement policies that were beginning to take shape in Britain. Although his warnings had not yet swayed the government, his persistence and growing evidence of the Nazi threat were starting to turn the tide of public opinion. The years of solitude and reflection were coming to an end, and Churchill was about to re-emerge as a central figure in the political arena, ready to lead Britain through the greatest challenge it had ever faced. In 1934, Churchill continued to sound the alarm about the dangers posed by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. He warned that Germany was rearming at an alarming rate, violating the Treaty of Versailles, and that Britain was woefully unprepared for the possibility of another major conflict. Churchill's speeches during this time were impassioned and filled with a sense of urgency, but they often fell on deaf ears. The prevailing mood in Britain was one of pacifism and a strong desire to avoid the horrors of another war. Many people, including influential politicians, believed that the Treaty of Versailles had been too harsh on Germany and that Hitler's demands for territorial revision were understandable and justifiable. Despite the resistance he faced, Churchill refused to be silenced. He continued to gather intelligence on German rearmament and used every opportunity to present his findings to the public and to Parliament. He argued that Britain needed to rearm and prepare for war, even if doing so was unpopular. Churchill's position was further complicated by the fact that many of his conservative colleagues, including Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, were committed to a policy of appeasement, seeking to resolve disputes with Germany through negotiation and compromise rather than confrontation. Throughout 1935 and 1936, Churchill's warnings became more pointed as the situation in Europe deteriorated. In 1935, the Anglo-German Naval Agreement was signed, allowing Germany to build a navy up to 35% the size of the Royal Navy. Churchill criticized the agreement as a dangerous concession that only served to embolden Hitler. In 1936, the German reoccupation of the Rhineland, a clear violation of the Treaty of Versailles, was met with little resistance from Britain or France. Churchill condemned the lack of action, seeing it as a missed opportunity to check Hitler's ambitions before they spiraled out of control. As the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, Churchill also became increasingly concerned about the spread of fascism beyond Germany. He saw the conflict in Spain as part of a broader struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, and he urged Britain to take a firmer stand against fascist regimes. However, his calls for intervention were largely ignored, as the British government pursued a policy of non-intervention, hoping to avoid being drawn into another European conflict. By 1937, Neville Chamberlain had become Prime Minister, and the policy of appeasement reached its peak. Chamberlain believed that by negotiating with Hitler and making concessions, Britain could avoid war. Churchill, however, saw this approach as deeply misguided. He argued that appeasement would only encourage Hitler to make more aggressive demands, and that Britain's position would be weakened if it continued to allow Germany to violate international agreements with impunity. Churchill's isolation from mainstream politics during this period was profound. He was often portrayed as a warmonger, out of touch with the public's desire for peace. Yet, he continued to speak out, motivated by a deep sense of duty and a belief that he was seeing the truth that others were ignoring. His persistence began to pay off, as some politicians and members of the public started to recognize the validity of his concerns, particularly as Hitler's actions became more brazen. In 1938, the situation reached a critical point with the Munich Agreement, where Chamberlain and other European leaders agreed to allow Germany to annex the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia, in exchange for a promise of no further territorial expansion. Chamberlain returned to Britain claiming to have secured peace for our time, but Churchill was deeply critical of the agreement. He famously declared in Parliament that Britain and France had chosen shame and would get war as well. His words were prescient, as the Munich Agreement only served to delay the inevitable conflict. The final year before the outbreak of World War II, 1939, saw Churchill's warnings finally gain the attention they deserved. As Hitler broke his promises and continued his aggressive expansion, seizing the rest of Czechoslovakia in March, it became clear to many that appeasement had failed. The British government began to take steps to prepare for war, including rearmament and the formation of alliances, but many feared it was too little, too late. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and Britain and France declared war on Germany. Churchill was immediately appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, returning to the position he had held during World War I. His appointment marked the beginning of his return to the forefront of British politics. The nation, now facing the reality of war, turned to Churchill for his experience, leadership, and unwavering resolve in the face of tyranny. The years leading up to World War II had been some of the most challenging in Churchill's career. He had been vilified, marginalized, and dismissed as an alarmist. Yet, his steadfastness, his deep understanding of the threats facing Britain, and his willingness to speak out despite the personal and political costs had positioned him as the leader Britain would soon desperately need. As the world plunged into war once more, Churchill was ready to play the role that history had been preparing him for, the defender of democracy and the leader who would guide Britain through its darkest hour. The 5 years from 1939 to 1944 were the most defining period of Winston Churchill's life and career. During these years, he transformed from a politically marginalized figure into one of the most significant and celebrated leaders in history. This period was dominated by World War II, and Churchill's role as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom became central to the Allied effort to defeat Nazi Germany. When World War II began in September 1939 with the German invasion of Poland, Churchill was brought back into government as First Lord of the Admiralty, a position he had held during World War I. His return to this role was met with relief by many who recognized his military experience and his early warnings about the Nazi threat. Almost immediately, Churchill began to exert his influence over British naval strategy, focusing on protecting shipping routes and preparing the Royal Navy for the conflict ahead. The early months of the war were marked by a period known as the Phony War, where there was little direct combat between the major powers. However, this lull ended abruptly in the spring of 1940, when Germany launched a series of lightning offensives that quickly overwhelmed much of Western Europe. Denmark and Norway fell in April, followed by the rapid conquest of the Netherlands, Belgium, and France in May and June. The speed and ferocity of the German blitzkrieg shocked the world and brought Britain to the brink of disaster. In May 1940, as the German forces swept through France, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain resigned, recognizing that his policy of appeasement had failed and that Britain needed a leader who could rally the nation in its darkest hour. Churchill, despite lingering suspicions about his judgment, was appointed Prime Minister on May 10, 1940, the same day that Germany launched its invasion of France and the Low Countries. Churchill's first months as Prime Minister were some of the most critical in British history. The situation was dire, France was on the verge of collapse, and Britain stood alone against the might of Nazi Germany. Churchill's first major challenge was the Dunkirk evacuation, where he ordered a massive effort to rescue over 300,000 British and Allied soldiers trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk by advancing German forces. The successful evacuation, though a strategic retreat, was framed as a miracle of deliverance and helped boost British morale at a time of extreme vulnerability. Following the fall of France in June 1940, Britain faced a very real threat of invasion. Hitler's forces dominated Europe, and the Luftwaffe began a massive bombing campaign against Britain, known as the Battle of Britain. Churchill's leadership during this period was characterized by his indomitable spirit and his ability to inspire the British people through his powerful speeches. His famous declaration, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender," became a rallying cry for a nation under siege. Churchill also played a crucial role in strengthening Britain's alliances, particularly with the United States. He recognized that Britain could not defeat Germany alone and worked tirelessly to build a close relationship with U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. This relationship culminated in the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, which allowed the United States to provide vital military aid to Britain even before officially entering the war. Churchill's efforts to secure American support were instrumental in sustaining Britain during the war's early years. The year 1941 was a turning point in the war. In June, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, opening up a massive eastern front that would drain German resources and manpower. Churchill, despite his deep distrust of communism, immediately recognized the strategic importance of supporting the Soviet Union in its struggle against Nazi Germany. He famously remarked, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." This pragmatic approach led to an uneasy alliance between Britain, the Soviet Union, and eventually the United States, forming the core of the Allied powers. In December 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States fully into the war, marking the beginning of the global conflict. Churchill understood that American involvement would be decisive, and he traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with Roosevelt and coordinate Allied strategy. The two leaders developed a close personal relationship, and their collaboration laid the groundwork for the eventual Allied victory. Throughout 1942 and 1943, Churchill focused on maintaining the war effort on multiple fronts. The North African Campaign, which saw the eventual defeat of German and Italian forces, was a significant victory for the Allies and marked the beginning of the pushback against Axis powers. Churchill also oversaw preparations for the invasion of Italy, known as the soft underbelly of Europe, which began in 1943. The Italian campaign, while difficult and protracted, further weakened the Axis and brought the Allies closer to the heart of Europe. However, the war was not without setbacks and tragedies. The heavy bombing of British cities, the loss of life in battles like those in North Africa and Italy, and the ongoing threat from German U-boats in the Atlantic placed enormous pressure on Churchill and the British people. Yet, Churchill remained resolute, using his speeches to bolster morale and his strategic acumen to guide the war effort. By 1944, the Allied forces were preparing for the most significant operation of the war, the invasion of Normandy, known as D-Day. Churchill played a key role in the planning and coordination of the invasion, which aimed to liberate Western Europe from Nazi control. The successful landings on June 6, 1944, marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany as Allied forces pushed inland from the beaches and began the liberation of France. Churchill's leadership during these years had been nothing short of extraordinary. He had taken Britain from the brink of defeat to the cusp of victory, forging alliances, maintaining public morale, and guiding military strategy with a combination of pragmatism, determination, and inspirational rhetoric. As 1944 drew to a close, the defeat of Nazi Germany was in sight, but Churchill knew that there were still challenges ahead, both in securing final victory and in shaping the post-war world. In 1944, as the war in Europe entered its final stages, Churchill played a crucial role in coordinating the Allied efforts to defeat Germany. The successful D-Day landings in Normandy in June 1944 marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe, and Churchill was deeply involved in the strategic decisions that followed. He continued to work closely with U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, though the alliance was increasingly strained by differing visions for the post-war world. Churchill was acutely aware of the geopolitical implications of the war's end. While he was determined to see Germany defeated, he was also concerned about the growing influence of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. As the Red Army advanced westward, Churchill feared that Stalin would seek to establish communist regimes across the region, creating a new kind of tyranny to replace the defeated Nazis. These concerns were evident in the tense negotiations that took place at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, where Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin discussed the future of Europe. Despite Churchill's efforts to secure a free and democratic post-war Europe, the Yalta agreements reflected the realities of Soviet power on the ground, leaving Churchill deeply uneasy about the future. In May 1945, Germany finally surrendered, bringing an end to the war in Europe. Churchill was hailed as a hero in Britain, and his leadership was widely credited with helping to save the nation during its darkest hours. However, the war in the Pacific continued, and Churchill remained focused on ensuring Japan's defeat while also addressing the immense task of post-war reconstruction. Despite his wartime popularity, Churchill faced a political shock in the summer of 1945. The general election, held in July, resulted in a landslide victory for the Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee. The election's outcome was a reflection of the British public's desire for social change and reform after the hardships of the war. The Labour Party's promises of nationalisation, social welfare, and a new economic order resonated with voters who were eager for a fresh start. Churchill's Conservative Party, associated with the pre-war status quo, was decisively rejected. Churchill, who had been at the pinnacle of power, now found himself out of office, replaced by Attlee as Prime Minister. The defeat was a bitter blow for Churchill, who had devoted himself entirely to the war effort and had expected to lead the country in peace as well. Nevertheless, he accepted the result with characteristic grace, declaring that the British people have a right to vote as they please. They have the right to dismiss their servants when they so wish. Out of office, Churchill took on the role of leader of the opposition. Though he was no longer in power, he remained a towering figure in British politics and on the world stage. During this period, Churchill's focus shifted to the emerging Cold War as tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union escalated. Churchill's deep-seated fears about Soviet expansionism were confirmed as communist governments were installed across Eastern Europe. In March 1946, Churchill delivered one of his most famous speeches in Fulton, Missouri, where he coined the term Iron Curtain to describe the division of Europe between the Free West and the Soviet-dominated East. In his speech, he warned that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. This speech is often seen as one of the first major statements of the Cold War, marking Churchill as an early and vocal critic of Soviet policy. Churchill's warnings about the Soviet Union were initially met with some skepticism, particularly in the United States, where many still hoped for a cooperative relationship with the USSR. However, as the Cold War deepened, Churchill's views gained increasing credibility, and he became recognized as a leading advocate for the Western alliance against communism. During these years, Churchill also continued to write and publish, further solidifying his reputation as one of the great historians and authors of his time. He began work on his monumental history of World War II, which would eventually be published in 6 volumes and become a key part of his literary legacy. Churchill's writing not only provided him with a source of income but also allowed him to shape the narrative of the war and his role in it. By 1949, Churchill was preparing for a potential return to power. The post-war Labour government, despite its ambitious social reforms, was facing economic difficulties and growing public dissatisfaction. Churchill's warnings about the dangers of socialism and the need for a strong defense in the face of Soviet aggression resonated with a public increasingly concerned about the direction of the country. In 1950, Britain held a general election in which the Labour government, led by Clement Attlee, narrowly retained power. However, the slim majority left the government vulnerable, and another election was called in 1951. By this time, Churchill had been working tirelessly to rebuild the Conservative Party's strength, capitalizing on public dissatisfaction with Labour's handling of the economy and the growing concerns about the Soviet threat. Churchill's message of stability, strong defense, and opposition to socialism resonated with voters, and the Conservatives won a decisive victory in the 1951 election. At the age of 76, Churchill once again became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Churchill's return to Downing Street was met with a mixture of admiration and skepticism. Many respected his wartime leadership and his deep understanding of global affairs, but there were also concerns about his age and health. Nevertheless, Churchill approached his second premiership with the same energy and determination that had characterized his earlier years in power. One of Churchill's primary focuses during this period was managing Britain's role in the emerging Cold War. He was deeply concerned about the spread of communism and the threat posed by the Soviet Union, and he worked to strengthen Britain's alliances with the United States and other Western powers. Churchill played a key role in the development of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was established in 1949 as a military alliance to counter Soviet influence in Europe. He believed that a strong and united Western alliance was essential to maintaining peace and preventing the spread of totalitarianism. Domestically, Churchill faced the challenge of revitalizing the British economy, which had been strained by the costs of World War II and the demands of post-war reconstruction. While he was committed to preserving many of the social reforms introduced by the Labour government, such as the National Health Service, Churchill also sought to reduce government intervention in the economy and encourage private enterprise. His government focused on reducing public spending, controlling inflation, and promoting economic growth, though these efforts were met with mixed results. Despite the pressures of office, Churchill continued to maintain an active role in foreign affairs. He remained committed to preserving Britain's global influence even as the country's empire was beginning to decline. Churchill was particularly concerned about the situation in the Middle East, where tensions were rising over issues such as the future of the Suez Canal and the emergence of nationalist movements in former colonies. He also took a keen interest in the development of nuclear weapons, recognizing that nuclear deterrence would play a central role in maintaining peace during the Cold War. However, the realities of Britain's post-war situation meant that Churchill had to navigate the decline of the British Empire and the country's reduced status on the world stage. The independence of India and Pakistan in 1947 had marked the beginning of the end of the British Empire, and Churchill now faced the challenge of managing the transition from empire to Commonwealth. This period saw the beginning of decolonization in Africa and Asia, a process that would accelerate in the following decades. Churchill's second term as Prime Minister was also marked by a series of health problems. In 1953, he suffered a stroke, which was kept secret from the public. Although he recovered and continued to serve as Prime Minister, the stroke left him weakened, and there were growing concerns about his ability to continue in office. Despite these challenges, Churchill remained determined to fulfill his duties and continued to play an active role in government, though he began to delegate more responsibilities to his senior ministers. In 1953, Churchill was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, an honor that recognized his extensive body of written work, including his 6-volume history of World War II. The prize was a significant personal achievement for Churchill, who had long considered himself a writer as much as a politician. The Nobel Prize was also a testament to Churchill's ability to shape public understanding of history and his role in it. By 1954, it was becoming increasingly clear that Churchill's time as Prime Minister was drawing to a close. His health continued to decline, and there was growing pressure within the Conservative Party for him to step aside in favor of a younger leader. Nevertheless, Churchill remained a towering figure in British politics, respected for his leadership during the war and his unwavering commitment to Britain's place in the world. In 1954, Churchill was still serving as Prime Minister, but his declining health and advancing age made it increasingly difficult for him to continue in the demanding role. Despite these challenges, he remained determined to guide Britain through the complexities of the post-war world. His government focused on maintaining Britain's global influence, managing the transition from empire to Commonwealth, and navigating the Cold War tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. By 1955, however, it was clear that Churchill could no longer maintain the rigorous schedule required of a prime minister. In April of that year, after much deliberation and pressure from his colleagues, Churchill finally decided to step down. He formally resigned as Prime Minister on April 5, 1955, handing over the leadership to his chosen successor, Anthony Eden. Churchill's resignation marked the end of an era in British politics, as the man who had led Britain through its darkest days in World War II now stepped back from the limelight. After leaving office, Churchill remained a member of Parliament for the constituency of Woodford, a seat he had held since 1924. However, his involvement in parliamentary affairs became increasingly limited, and he focused more on writing, painting, and spending time with his family. Churchill's love of painting, which he had taken up as a hobby during World War I, provided him with a creative outlet and a source of relaxation in his later years. He continued to produce artworks, many of which were inspired by his travels and his country home, Chartwell. Churchill also devoted time to completing his memoirs and historical works. His 6-volume series, The Second World War, which had been published between 1948 and 1953, was widely acclaimed and contributed to his lasting reputation as a historian and author. In these years, Churchill also began work on his 4-volume A History of the English-Speaking Peoples, a sweeping narrative of the history of Britain and its former colonies. The first volume of this work was published in 1956, and the subsequent volumes followed over the next few years. Despite his retirement from active politics, Churchill's opinions and advice were still sought by world leaders. He maintained a close relationship with U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, with whom he had worked closely during World War II. Churchill's insights on the Cold War, the threat of nuclear conflict, and the importance of maintaining strong alliances continued to influence the policies of Western governments. In 1956, Churchill witnessed the Suez Crisis, a significant event in post-war British history that underscored the decline of British imperial power. The crisis, which arose from Egypt's nationalization of the Suez Canal and the subsequent military intervention by Britain, France, and Israel, ended in political and military failure for the Western powers. Churchill, though no longer in office, was deeply troubled by the way the crisis was handled, seeing it as a symbol of Britain's diminished global influence and a reminder of the changing world order. As the 1950s drew to a close, Churchill's health continued to deteriorate. He suffered a series of strokes, which further limited his ability to participate in public life. Despite these setbacks, he remained a figure of immense respect and admiration, both in Britain and abroad. In 1959, Churchill chose not to stand for re-election as a member of Parliament in the general election, marking the end of his long and storied political career. Churchill's retirement from Parliament brought an official close to his public life, but his influence remained profound. He was celebrated as one of the greatest leaders in British history, a man whose courage, vision, and determination had shaped the course of the 20th century. His legacy was enshrined not only in the memories of those who had lived through the war, but also in the countless books, speeches, and works of art that he had produced over his lifetime. By the end of 1959, Winston Churchill was living in quiet retirement at Chartwell, surrounded by his family and the things he loved. Though his physical health had declined, his mind remained sharp, and he continued to reflect on the events and decisions that had defined his life. As the 1960s approached, Churchill's place in history was already secure, and he remained a symbol of resilience, leadership, and the enduring spirit of the British people. After retiring from Parliament in 1959, Churchill spent most of his time at his beloved country home, Chartwell, in Kent. His physical health had weakened significantly by this time, largely due to a series of strokes that had impaired his mobility and speech. Despite these challenges, Churchill's mind remained sharp, and he continued to engage in his lifelong hobbies of writing and painting, although at a slower pace. Churchill's final years were marked by a series of personal and public honors that underscored the profound impact he had on British and world history. In 1963, he was made an honorary citizen of the United States by President John F. Kennedy, a rare honor that highlighted the close relationship he had forged with America during the war and his role in shaping the post-war world order. This gesture was a testament to Churchill's enduring influence on both sides of the Atlantic and his role as a key figure in the alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany. Churchill's 90th birthday in 1964 was celebrated with widespread public and private admiration. There were numerous tributes, both in Britain and internationally, reflecting on his contributions to the world. His life and achievements were commemorated in a variety of ways, including documentaries, articles, and retrospectives, all celebrating the man who had become synonymous with the fight for freedom and democracy. As Churchill's health continued to decline, his public appearances became increasingly rare. He was largely confined to Chartwell, where he was cared for by his family and a dedicated team of medical professionals. His wife, Clementine, remained by his side, providing him with unwavering support during these final years. The couple had shared a deep bond throughout their marriage, and Clementine's presence was a source of great comfort to Churchill in his final days. On January 15, 1965, Churchill suffered another severe stroke, which left him gravely ill. After 9 days, on the morning of January 24, 1965, Winston Churchill passed away at the age of 90. His death marked the end of an era in British history and was met with an outpouring of grief and respect from around the world. Churchill's state funeral, held on January 30, 1965, was one of the largest in British history, attended by representatives from more than 100 countries, including numerous heads of state and government. The funeral service at St. Paul's Cathedral in London was a solemn and dignified affair, reflecting the profound impact Churchill had on the nation and the world. His coffin was transported along the Thames River, flanked by naval vessels, in a poignant tribute to his service as First Lord of the Admiralty and his role in leading Britain through the war. Following the funeral service, Churchill was laid to rest in the family plot at St. Martin's Church in Blaydon, near his birthplace at Blenheim Palace. The burial was a private ceremony attended by his family and close friends, bringing to a close the life of one of the most significant figures of the 20th century. In the years since his death, Churchill's legacy has continued to be a subject of study, debate, and admiration. He is remembered not only for his leadership during World War II, but also for his contributions to literature, his defense of democracy, and his role in shaping the modern world. His speeches, writings, and political achievements remain a source of inspiration, and his life continues to be a symbol of courage, resilience, and unwavering commitment to the principles he held dear. Winston Churchill's final years were marked by a gradual withdrawal from public life, but his legacy only grew stronger after his passing. His influence on the course of history, his contributions to the defense of freedom, and his indomitable spirit have ensured that his memory endures as one of the greatest leaders of all time. As we come to the close of this remarkable journey through the life of Winston Churchill, it's clear that his legacy is one that continues to inspire and resonate around the world. Churchill was more than just a leader. He was a symbol of resilience, determination, and the unyielding spirit of a nation that stood firm in the face of unimaginable challenges. His contributions to history, from his steadfast leadership during World War II to his profound influence on the course of the 20th century, have left an indelible mark on the world. Churchill's life was one of extraordinary highs and lows, marked by moments of great triumph and profound difficulty. Yet through it all, he remained committed to his ideals and to the service of his country. His speeches, writings, and actions during some of history's darkest times continue to offer lessons in courage, perseverance, and the power of conviction. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of Winston Churchill's life and legacy. We hope that this journey has provided you with a deeper understanding of the man who played such a pivotal role in shaping the modern world. If you found this video informative and inspiring, please consider subscribing to our channel for more in-depth explorations of history's most influential figures. Until next time, keep learning, stay curious, and remember that the lessons of history are not just about the past. They're about how we can build a better future together. Thank you for watching.